The conference room fell silent as 15 men formed a semicircle around her desk, their arms crossed, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright contempt. Irene Hill didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply looked up from her blueprints, her green eyes steady, and asked the question that would change everything. Are you here to intimidate me, or are you actually ready to listen? What happened next would shatter every assumption they'd made about the quiet young woman they dismissed for 18 months. This is the story of how Irene Hill turned her greatest moment of isolation into her most powerful demonstration of strength. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Thornbridge Engineering's main design floor, casting geometric shadows across rows of drafting tables and computer workstations. Irene Hill arrived at 6:30, as she did every morning, a full hour before the rest of the structural engineering team would begin trickling in. At 26, Irene was the youngest civil engineer the firm had hired in over a decade. She was also the only woman in the structural division, a fact that had been mentioned exactly once during her interview and approximately 700 times since. Her desk sat in the corner of the vast open floor, positioned in a way that felt less like assignment and more like exile. She'd grown accustomed to the isolation. The way conversations would pause when she approached the coffee station, the subtle shifts in body language when she contributed ideas during team meetings, the carefully neutral expressions that somehow communicated complete dismissal more effectively than any words could. Irene came from a small village in the Austrian Alps, where her father had been a master stonemason and her grandfather before him. She'd grown up watching them work, understanding instinctively how weight distributed through stone, how structures found their balance, how the old buildings in her village had stood for centuries because someone had understood the fundamental language of physics and patience. She'd earned her degree from Technical University of Vienna with honors, her thesis on seismic resistance in historic architecture winning academic praise. Thornbridge had recruited her aggressively, promising opportunities to work on landmark restoration projects throughout Europe. What they'd failed to mention was that those opportunities would perpetually remain just out of reach. For 18 months, Irene had been assigned to what the senior engineers called support work, calculating load specifications that other engineers had already calculated, double-checking measurements that didn't need double-checking, creating detailed documentation for projects she'd never be allowed to actually design. Her supervisor, Edmund Hartley, was a 20-year veteran of structural engineering who treated Irene with the kind of paternal condescension that was somehow worse than outright hostility. He never yelled, never openly criticized. He simply smiled and nodded and assigned her work that a first-year intern could complete, all while telling her she was doing wonderfully and just needed more experience before taking on real responsibility. The current project consuming the entire department was the Cathedral of St. Benedict, a 16th century masterpiece that had suffered structural damage during recent flooding. The cathedral's south tower was leaning, its foundation compromised by water infiltration. The project was prestigious, complex, and potentially career-defining for whoever solved it. Irene had spent 3 months studying the cathedral on her own time. She'd driven there twice, walking the grounds, examining the stonework, measuring angles with equipment she'd borrowed without asking. She'd researched similar cases throughout Europe, studied historical construction techniques, analyzed soil composition reports. She'd developed a solution. Not just a patch or temporary fix, but a comprehensive restoration approach that would stabilize the tower while preserving its historic integrity. The design was elegant, cost-effective, and based on principles that the original builders would have recognized. Nobody had asked for her input. Nobody expected her to have one. The department head, Jeffrey Westbrook, had assigned the cathedral project to his senior team, 5 men with decades of combined experience, all of whom Irene had quietly outperformed in technical assessments and design competitions. But performance didn't matter when you were the young woman who didn't fit the image of what a structural engineer should look like. This morning, as Irene reviewed her unauthorized cathedral designs one final time, she overheard the conversation that confirmed what she'd suspected for months. The senior team's approach was fundamentally flawed. "We're looking at full foundation replacement," Thomas Brennan was saying to his colleague near the coffee station. "Strip it down to bedrock, rebuild from scratch. It's the only way to guarantee stability. Westbrook approved the budget increase, his colleague asked. Not yet, but he will. What choice does he have? The tower's leaning another 2 millimeters every month. We've got maybe 6 months before it becomes a genuine collapse risk. Irene's hands tightened on her coffee cup. Full foundation replacement would take 18 months, cost 3 million euros, and require dismantling significant portions of the historic structure. It was the engineering equivalent of using a sledgehammer to hang a picture frame. Her approach would take 4 months, cost a quarter of that amount, and preserve every stone of the original construction. But explaining this would require someone to actually listen to her, and in 18 months at Thornbridge, she learned that being right didn't matter if nobody was willing to hear you. She returned to her desk and pulled out the detailed portfolio she'd assembled. Structural analysis, historical research, computer modeling, alternative approaches with cost comparisons. She'd prepared everything a senior engineer would need to make an informed decision, and she'd done it knowing that presenting it might accomplish nothing. But she'd also learned something from her grandfather, who'd spent 50 years working stone in the Alps. Sometimes, he told her, the most important structures are the ones you build inside yourself. The foundation of certainty that lets you stand firm when everything else is trying to knock you down. Irene was about to test just how firm that foundation was. The morning meeting started at 9 sharp in the main conference room. It was a weekly ritual where the senior engineers presented progress updates and Jeffrey Westbrook dispensed wisdom and assignments like a monarch. Distributing favors, Irene sat in her usual position at the far end of the table, her notebook open, her posture attentive but not expectant. She'd learned not to hope for acknowledgement during these meetings. Hoping led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the kind of visible emotion that would be interpreted as proof she wasn't suited for the work. Today's agenda was dominated by the cathedral project. Thomas Brennan presented the team's foundation replacement proposal using a projector and 47 detailed slides. His presentation was thorough, professional, and based on conventional engineering wisdom that had guided similar projects for decades. It was also going to cost the firm's client an unnecessary fortune and destroy irreplaceable historic fabric in the process. Westbrook nodded approvingly throughout the presentation. Solid work, Thomas. This is exactly the kind of comprehensive approach the Cathedral Committee is looking for. Conservative, thorough, guaranteed results. There is one concern, Edmund Hartley interjected carefully. The timeline puts us well beyond the client's desired completion date. They were hoping for something faster. Fast, cheap, or good. Pick two, Brennan replied with the confident smile of someone who'd said this line many times before. They hired Thornbridge because they want it done right. They'll accept the timeline when they understand the alternatives. Irene's pen hovered over her notebook. The words formed in her mind with crystal clarity. There is an alternative. One that's faster, cheaper, and better. But voicing them meant crossing a line she'd been careful to avoid for 18 months. Any other questions? Westbrook asked, already gathering his papers as if the decision was finalized. Irene raised her hand. The gesture was so unexpected that it took several seconds for anyone to notice. When Westbrook finally looked in her direction, his expression suggested he'd just remembered she was in the room. Yes, Miss Hill? I've reviewed the cathedral specifications, Irene said, her voice steady despite the sudden attention of 15 male colleagues turning toward her. I believe there's a more effective approach worth considering. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Brennan's confident smile hardened into something less friendly. Hartley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wishing his mentee would stop talking. I'm sure you have, Westbrook replied with practiced patience. However, Thomas and his team have spent considerable time developing this proposal. Unless you have specific technical concerns with their analysis, this was the moment. Irene could demur, apologize for the interruption, and return to her comfortable position of invisible irrelevance. Or she could do what she'd come to Thornbridge to do, engineering that mattered. I do have concerns, she said. The foundation replacement approach doesn't account for the cathedral's original construction methodology. The 16th century builders used a floating foundation system specifically designed for the area's water table fluctuations. The current instability isn't foundation failure, it's water management failure. Brennan's expression shifted from annoyed to patronizing. With respect, Miss Hill, foundation systems from the 16th century are precisely why we're having problems. Modern engineering exists because historical approaches were inadequate. Actually, Irene continued, pulling out her portfolio, the historical approach was remarkably sophisticated. The original builders created a network of drainage channels that redirected groundwater away from the foundation. Those channels have been blocked by modern development. Restore the drainage system, and the foundation will stabilize naturally. She slid the portfolio across the table toward Westbrook. It contained everything: architectural surveys showing the original drainage network, soil analysis demonstrating current water saturation, computer models predicting stabilization outcomes, and detailed cost projections. Westbrook glanced at the portfolio but didn't open it. This is quite ambitious for someone in a support role. When did you find time for this analysis? My own time, Irene replied. I've been researching the project for 3 months, without authorization, Hartley added quietly, as if this detail was significant. Research doesn't require authorization, Irene said, meeting her supervisor's eyes. Neither does thinking. Several engineers shifted in their seats. The room's atmosphere had moved beyond uncomfortable into something approaching hostile. Irene had violated an unspoken rule. She'd challenged senior engineers in a public forum, and she'd done it with evidence. Westbrook finally opened the portfolio, flipping through pages with the kind of speed that suggested he wasn't actually reading anything. This is interesting work, Miss Hill. Very thorough. However, Thomas and his team have expertise you simply don't have yet. Years of experience with projects of this complexity. Experience doing things the expensive way, Irene said, and immediately regretted the edge in her voice. Brennan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I've been engineering structural solutions since before you were born. I don't need a junior associate who's never led a project telling me how to do my job. I'm not telling you how to do your job, Irene replied, forcing herself to remain seated and calm. I'm presenting an alternative solution based on historical precedent and structural analysis. Whether you consider it is your decision. How generous, Brennan said. Tell me, Miss Hill, how many 16th century cathedrals have you personally restored? None. How many have you restored using their original engineering principles rather than fighting against them? The question hung in the air like smoke. Several engineers looked away, unwilling to watch the confrontation escalate. Westbrook closed the portfolio and slid it back across the table. We appreciate your initiative, he said in a tone that communicated the exact opposite. However, this firm has procedures for project proposals. If you believe you have a viable alternative, submit it through proper channels. Edmund, please work with Miss Hill on understanding our protocols. It was a dismissal disguised as process. They would never seriously consider her proposal because acknowledging its merit would mean admitting they'd overlooked both the problem and the solution. Irene took the portfolio back, her hand steady even as frustration burned in her chest. She'd known this outcome was likely, but knowing didn't make it easier to accept. As the meeting dispersed, she overheard Brennan muttering to a colleague, 18 months, and she still doesn't understand how things work around here. Irene understood perfectly. Things worked by maintaining established hierarchies, by never challenging authority, by accepting that competence mattered less than compliance. She also understood something else. She was done accepting it. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The afternoon stretched long and tense after the morning meeting. Irene returned to her desk in the corner, her portfolio feeling heavier than it had that morning. Around her, the design floor hummed with its usual activity, but she could feel the shift in atmosphere. Conversation stopped when she passed. Eyes followed her movements with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Edmund Hartley appeared at her desk just before lunch, his expression carefully arranged into concerned mentor mode. Irene, we need to talk about what happened in there. I presented a technical solution to a technical pair. Problem, Irene replied, not looking up from her computer screen where she was reviewing stress calculations. You challenged senior engineers in a public forum. That's not how we operate here. Hartley pulled up a chair, lowering his voice. I understand you're eager to contribute more substantially, and that's admirable. But there's a process, a hierarchy. You can't just leap over years of experience and expect people to take you seriously. The solution doesn't care about hierarchy, Irene said. Physics doesn't care who presents the equations. Either the approach works or it doesn't. Hartley sighed, the sound of a patient man reaching his limits. Engineering isn't just about solutions, Irene. It's about trust, relationships, proving yourself over time. You've been here 18 months. That's not enough time to build the credibility needed for projects like the cathedral. How much time is enough? Irene asked, finally looking at him directly. 2 years? 5? 10? Or is the real answer never? Because I'll never fit what you all expect a structural engineer to look like. The words hung between them, making explicit what had always remained carefully unspoken. Hartley's face reddened slightly. That's not fair. We've given you opportunities. You've given me busy work, Irene corrected. Calculations that were already complete, documentation that nobody reads. You've kept me busy while keeping me irrelevant. Because you need to develop, Hartley insisted. Nobody starts with cathedral restorations. You work your way up, prove your reliability on smaller projects first. Irene pulled up her file directory, clicking through folders she'd organized meticulously. I've completed 63 assignments in 18 months. Every single one delivered early with 0 errors. I've identified cost savings on 12 different projects that your senior engineers missed. I've corrected calculation errors in 7 structural reports before they reached clients. How much more do I need to prove before someone actually sees me? Hartley stared at the screen, clearly unaware of the extent of her contributions. His silence spoke volumes about how little attention he'd actually paid to her work beyond confirming she'd completed assigned tasks. This isn't about your technical skills, he finally said, his voice quieter. It's about how you present yourself. Your approach in that meeting was aggressive, confrontational. If you want people to listen to you, you need to be more diplomatic. More diplomatic, Irene repeated flatly. You mean quieter, more agreeable, less threatening to men who are used to being the smartest people in the room. I mean more professional, Hartley corrected, standing up. Jeffrey wants to see you in his office at 3. I suggest you think about how you want your career here to proceed. He walked away, leaving Irene alone with her computer screen and the crystallizing certainty that no amount of diplomacy would change the fundamental problem. They didn't want her to be better at being heard. They wanted her to be better at being ignored. At 3 o'clock, she walked to Jeffrey Westbrook's office, her portfolio tucked under her arm. The department head sat behind an enormous desk that seemed designed to emphasize the distance between his authority and everyone else's subordination. Sit down, Miss Hill, he said, not unkindly. Let's talk about your future at Thornbridge. Irene sat, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She'd learned long ago that appearing emotional in these situations only reinforced every stereotype they already held. You're a talented engineer, Westbrook began. Your technical work has been consistently excellent, but talent alone doesn't make someone ready for senior responsibility. There are other factors: judgment, teamwork, understanding your role within the larger organization. My role being to stay quiet and not question my superiors, Irene said. Westbrook's expression hardened slightly. Your role being to learn from people with more experience, to respect the collaborative process, to understand that engineering is as much about managing people as it is about managing structures. And the cathedral? Irene asked. My solution will not be pursued, Westbrook said firmly. Thomas's approach is sound, proven, and has the confidence of this department. Your alternative, however interesting academically, represents too much risk for a project of this importance. The words were final, absolute. Irene realized with perfect clarity that nothing she said in this moment would change his mind. The decision had been made before she'd even entered the office. I understand, she said quietly. Good, then we can move forward productively. Westbrook smiled, clearly relieved the conversation had gone so smoothly. I'm assigning you to support documentation for the cathedral project. Your attention to detail will be valuable for ensuring we maintain proper records throughout the restoration. Documentation. Of course, the structural engineering equivalent of taking notes while others made history. Irene stood, shook Westbrook's hand, and left his office with her portfolio still unopened under her arm. Behind her, she heard him already moving on to his next task, the conversation already forgotten. But Irene wasn't going to forget. Not this conversation, and not what she needed to do next. Part 4. That evening, Irene sat in her small apartment overlooking the city, the cathedral visible in the distance, its leaning south tower silhouetted against the sunset. Her laptop was open, displaying the structural analysis she'd spent months developing. Around her, the walls were covered with maps, photographs, and hand-drawn sketches of the cathedral's foundation system. Her phone rang. The screen showed her father's number, calling from the village where she'd grown up. She considered not answering, but her father had an uncanny ability to know when something was wrong. Irene, his familiar voice came through, warm and concerned. "You haven't called in 2 weeks. Your mother is worried." "I've been busy with work," Irene replied, which was true but incomplete. Busy is good. Busy and happy is better. "You don't sound happy." Irene found herself telling him about the meeting, about Westbrook's decision, about 18 months of being professionally invisible. Her father listened without interrupting, the way he always had when she was young and frustrated by problems that seemed insurmountable. "Do you remember," he said when she finished, "when you were 12 and wanted to help with the Hoffman restoration?" Irene smiled despite herself. The Hoffman family had hired her father to repair their 18th century barn, and she'd begged to assist. "You let me carry tools and mix mortar." "You hated it," her father continued. "You wanted to do the actual stonework, but I wouldn't let you. You were furious with me. You said I wasn't ready, that I needed to learn patience." "I was wrong," her father said quietly. "Do you remember what you did?" Irene did remember. She'd waited until her father left for the day, then returned to the site with her own tools. She'd repaired a section of wall that he'd been planning to tackle the next day, using techniques she'd observed him perform dozens of times. "You were angry when you found out," Irene recalled. "For about 5 minutes. Then I looked at your work and realized it was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. You'd improved on my approach, found a more stable way to set the stones." Her father paused. "I learned something important that day. Sometimes the people we think aren't ready are actually ahead of where we are. Sometimes being ready means being willing to prove it, even when nobody's given you permission." "They won't consider my solution," Irene said. "Westbrook made that clear." "Then stop asking for consideration. Show them why your solution is right." After the call ended, Irene sat in the darkening apartment, her father's words echoing in her mind. "Stop asking for consideration. Show them why your solution is right." She pulled up her files and began to plan. Not a plan to convince Westbrook or win over Brennan or navigate proper channels. A plan to prove beyond any possible doubt that her approach was correct. Over the next 3 weeks, Irene maintained her regular duties with flawless efficiency while pursuing her own project in every spare moment. She drove to the cathedral after work, conducting her own site surveys with equipment she rented using her personal savings. She interviewed elderly residents who remembered when the cathedral's grounds had different drainage patterns. She obtained historical records from the city archives showing the original construction plans. Most importantly, she built a comprehensive demonstration model. Using her apartment's spare room, she constructed a scale replica of the cathedral's foundation system, complete with the original drainage network and the modern blockages that were causing the instability. She documented everything with photographs, measurements, and time-lapse video. Her colleagues at Thornbridge noticed she'd become even quieter than usual. Hartley commented that she seemed more focused, which he interpreted as acceptance of her role. What he didn't know was that she was preparing the most important presentation of her career, one that nobody had asked for and nobody expected. The Cathedral Committee was scheduled to review Thornbridge's foundation replacement proposal in 4 weeks. The meeting would include city officials, historic preservation representatives, and funding authorities. It was the final approval stage before the expensive, destructive work would begin. Irene knew she had one chance to present her alternative, not through Thornbridge's hierarchy, not through proper channels, but directly to the people who would ultimately make the decision. It would mean going around her employer, potentially ending her career at the firm, and facing professional consequences she couldn't fully predict. But it would also mean 15 men would have to listen to her. Really listen. Not to a junior engineer asking for consideration, but to someone who had done the work, gathered the evidence, and refused to accept dismissal as the final answer. She spent her evenings refining her presentation, anticipating every objection, preparing responses to every challenge. She contacted the committee secretary and requested permission to present an alternative proposal as an independent structural engineer, carefully wording her request to avoid mentioning her employment with Thornbridge. The response came back within 3 days. Permission granted. 10 minutes for presentation and questions. 10 minutes. 600 seconds to overturn months of planning by dissident, Thornbridge's senior team, to prove that the quiet woman they dismissed had seen the problem more clearly than anyone else. Irene looked at the cathedral in the distance and smiled. Her grandfather had told her that the strongest structures were built on foundations of certainty. She'd spent 18 months building that foundation inside herself. Now it was time to show them exactly how strong she'd become. The morning of the committee meeting arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharply defined. Irene dressed carefully in a professional dark suit, her hair pulled back severely, every detail calibrated to project competence and authority. She loaded her car with the presentation materials, the scale model carefully secured in the trunk, and drove to the city council building where the meeting would take place. She arrived an hour early, requesting access to the presentation room to set up her materials. The committee secretary, a efficient woman named Helena, helped her arrange the display tables and test the projection equipment. "I should mention," Helena said as they worked, "representatives from Thornbridge Engineering will be presenting first. Are you aware of that?" "I am," Irene replied calmly. "And you're comfortable presenting an alternative to your own firm's proposal?" Irene met Helena's curious gaze directly. "I'm comfortable presenting the correct solution, regardless of who else is in the room." Helena smiled slightly. "This should be interesting then." The committee members began arriving at 9:30. Irene recognized several faces from news coverage: the mayor's deputy for historic preservation, 3 city council members, representatives from the European Heritage Foundation, and the cathedral's restoration board. They settled into their seats with coffee and documents, the casual atmosphere of people expecting a routine approval meeting. At 9:45, Jeffrey Westbrook entered with Thomas Brennan and Edmund Hartley. All 3 stopped short when they saw Irene setting up her display. Westbrook's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and then a carefully controlled anger. He crossed the room quickly, his voice low and tight. "Miss Hill, what exactly are you doing here?" "Presenting an alternative proposal to the committee," Irene replied, continuing to arrange her materials without looking at him. "You're employed by Thornbridge Engineering. You can't present alternatives to our official proposals. I'm presenting as an independent structural engineer. I'm not representing Thornbridge." Brennan had joined them, his expression darker than Westbrook's. "This is insubordination. You're using research you conducted on company time to undermine our project." "I conducted my research on my own time, with my own resources," Irene corrected. "I'm presenting my own conclusions based on my own analysis. If your proposal is sound, mine won't affect it." "If this goes forward," Westbrook said, his voice carrying a warning, "there will be consequences for your employment." Irene finally looked at him directly. "I understand, but this meeting is going forward regardless." Helena stepped forward diplomatically. "Gentlemen, Miss Hill requested presentation time through proper channels. The committee approved her request. Unless you want to challenge the committee's authority to hear alternative proposals?" Westbrook stepped back, clearly calculating his options. Challenging the committee publicly would look defensive and might draw more attention to Irene's alternative than ignoring it. He settled for a tight nod and moved to take his seat, followed by Brennan and Hartley. As they passed, Hartley gave Irene a look that mixed disappointment with something that might have been reluctant respect. The committee chairman, Director Werner Schmidt, called the meeting to order at 10 o'clock sharp. We're here to review final proposals for the Cathedral of St. Benedict Restoration Project. Thornbridge Engineering will present first, followed by an alternative proposal from, he consulted his notes, independent engineer Irene Hill. Let's begin. Westbrook stood and moved to the presentation podium with practiced confidence. His presentation was polished and professional, walking the committee through the foundation replacement plan with impressive technical detail and slick visual aids. He spoke about soil remediation, modern engineering standards, and guaranteed structural stability for the next century. The committee listened attentively, asking technical questions that Westbrook answered with easy authority. The presentation took 35 minutes, well over the scheduled time, but nobody seemed to mind. This was Thornbridge, after all, with decades of successful projects backing their reputation. When Westbrook finished, Director Schmidt thanked him and turned to Irene. Ms. Hill, you have 10 minutes for your presentation. Irene stood and walked to the podium, acutely aware of every eye in the room. 15 men on the committee, 3 more from Thornbridge, who wanted nothing more than to see her fail. She placed her notes on the podium and looked at the assembled officials. Members of the committee, I'm going to tell you why spending 3 million euros to replace the cathedral's foundation is not just expensive and time-consuming. It's wrong. The room went completely silent. Westbrook's expression tightened. Brennan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, ready to catalog every flaw in her argument. Irene advanced her first slide, a photograph of the cathedral from 1523, shortly after its completion. The builders who constructed this cathedral weren't primitive craftsmen using guesswork. They were sophisticated engineers who understood their environment intimately. This building has stood for 500 years, not despite its foundation system, but because of it. She clicked to the next slide, showing detailed drawings of the original drainage network. The cathedral sits on alluvial soil with a high water table. The 16th century builders created a floating foundation system with an integrated drainage network that managed groundwater flow. This wasn't a weakness. It was brilliant engineering specifically designed for these conditions. One of the council members raised his hand. But surely modern foundations would be more stable? Modern foundations are designed for modern construction, Irene replied. This structure was built to move slightly with seasonal water table changes. That flexibility is what's kept it stable for 5 centuries. Replacing it with a rigid modern foundation fights against the building's inherent design rather than working with it. She revealed the scale model, which drew immediate interest from the committee. I have constructed a functional demonstration of both the original system and the current problem. May I show you? Director Schmidt nodded, and several committee members stood to get a closer look at the model. Irene had built it to precise scale, showing a cross-section of the cathedral's foundation with removable components that demonstrated how the drainage system functioned. The original system, Irene explained, manipulating the model's components, used a series of stone channels to redirect groundwater away from the foundation. Watch what happens when I introduce water to the model with the drainage system functioning. She poured water into the model's soil simulation. The liquid flowed through the miniature drainage channels and away from the foundation area, leaving the structural base stable and dry. The committee members watched with obvious fascination. Now watch what happens when I block the drainage channels, simulating current conditions where modern development has disrupted the original water management system. She blocked several channels with small barriers. When she added water this time, it pooled around the foundation area, causing the model's tower to tilt noticeably. The demonstration was simple but devastatingly effective. The cathedral isn't failing because its foundation is inadequate, Irene continued. It's failing because we've broken the system that kept it stable for 500 years. The solution isn't replacement. It's restoration. Brennan spoke up from his seat, his voice carrying skeptical authority. That's a very pretty demonstration, Miss Hill, but a scale model isn't the same as real-world engineering. You're dramatically oversimplifying complex structural issues. Am I? Irene pulled out a thick folder of documents. I've conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys that confirm the original drainage network still exists underground, exactly where the historical plans indicated it would be. I've analyzed soil samples showing current water saturation levels and projected how they would change with restored drainage. I've created computer models that predict stabilization outcomes with 94% confidence. She distributed copies of her analysis to each committee member, watching their expression shift from polite interest to genuine engagement as they scanned the technical data. More importantly, Irene continued, I've researched 12 similar cases throughout Europe where historic structures experienced foundation issues. In every case where engineers restored original water management systems rather than replacing foundations, the building stabilized completely at a fraction of the cost and time of modern replacements. Director Schmidt was studying her documents intently. Your projected timeline is 4 months, compared to Thornbridge's 18 months. That seems optimistic. It's based on actual drainage restoration work, not optimism, Irene replied. The stone channels already exist. We're clearing blockages and creating new outflow paths, not building from scratch. Most of the work is excavation and modern pipe connection, which is straightforward civil engineering. Westbrook stood, his patience clearly exhausted. Director Schmidt, if I may, Miss Hill is a junior engineer with limited field experience. While I appreciate her enthusiasm, this committee shouldn't base a decision of this magnitude on untested theories presented by someone who's never actually led a restoration project. These aren't untested theories, Irene said, her voice remaining level despite the dismissal. They're proven principles that have guided successful restorations throughout Europe. What's untested is the assumption that we can improve on 500 years of proven stability with modern intervention. One of the Heritage Foundation representatives leaned forward. Ms. Hill, you mentioned cost projections. What's your estimated budget? 750,000 euros for complete drainage restoration, including contingency funds, Irene replied, compared to 3 million for foundation replacement. The number caused visible reactions around the table. In an era of tight heritage budgets, saving over 2 million euros was impossible to ignore. Brennan's voice carried an edge of desperation now. Cost shouldn't be the primary factor when we're talking about structural integrity. Thornbridge's approach guarantees stability. So does mine, Irene countered. The difference is that mine preserves the cathedral's historic integrity, while yours destroys it. Foundation replacement means dismantling significant portions of the original structure. We'd be saving the building by fundamentally changing what makes it historically valuable. She advanced to her final slide, showing a side-by-side comparison. Thornbridge's approach with its extensive structural intervention, and her approach with minimal visible changes and complete historic preservation. This committee has a choice, Irene said quietly. Spend 3 million euros and 18 months to fight against the cathedral's original engineering, or spend a quarter of that to work with the brilliant design that's already kept this building standing for 5 centuries. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Director Schmidt spoke. Miss Hill, can you give us a moment to confer? Of course. The committee members huddled together, their voices low but animated. Irene could see them referring repeatedly to her documents, pointing at specific sections, comparing notes. Westbrook sat with Brennan and Hartley, his expression thunderous. He caught Irene's eye, and the look he gave her promised exactly the professional consequences he'd warned about. Irene met his gaze calmly. Whatever happened next, she'd done what she came to do. She'd made them listen, not because they wanted to, but because she left them no choice except to either engage with her evidence or expose their own willful dismissal of a superior solution. After 5 minutes of consultation, Director Schmidt called the room back to order. We'd like to ask some additional technical questions. Miss Hill, can you walk us through the specific drainage restoration process? For the next 40 minutes, Irene answered every question the committee posed. Technical specifications, timeline details, risk assessments, contingency planning. She had answers for everything because she'd spent months preparing for exactly these questions. Westbrook tried repeatedly to interject, to raise doubts, to reassert Thornbridge's authority. But each time, Irene had evidence that directly addressed his concerns. She'd anticipated every objection because she'd heard variations of them for 18 months. Finally, Director Schmidt raised his hand for silence. I think we have enough information. This committee will take 2 weeks to review both proposals and make a final decision. Thornbridge, Miss Hill, thank you for your presentations. As the committee members filed out, several stopped to shake Irene's hand and thank her for the thorough analysis. One of the Heritage Foundation representatives lingered. Regardless of the committee's decision, that was exceptional work. Have you considered independent consulting? I might need to, Irene replied, glancing at where Westbrook stood with his colleagues, clearly waiting for the room to clear so he could confront her. When only the Thornbridge team remained, Westbrook approached slowly, his anger now contained behind professional coldness. My office, tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. We'll discuss your termination. I understand, Irene said simply. As they left, Edmund Hartley paused at the door and looked back at her. Why, Irene? Why throw away your career for this? Irene began packing up her model carefully. Because having a career where I'm not allowed to use my skills isn't really a career at all. It's just employment. Alone in the empty conference room, surrounded by her evidence and her model and her vindication, Irene allowed herself a small smile. She let 15 men surround her, doubt her, and dismiss her. And then she'd shown them exactly who she was. An engineer who understood that the strongest foundations aren't always the newest ones, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay quiet when everyone expects your silence. The next morning, Irene arrived at Thornbridge Engineering at 7:45, 15 minutes early for what she knew would be her final meeting as an employee. She'd spent the previous evening organizing her personal files, separating her own research from anything that belonged to the company. Her desk was already cleared, her belongings packed into 2 boxes that sat in her car's trunk. The design floor was nearly empty at this hour, just a few early arrivals who looked up as she passed and quickly looked away. Word had spread about yesterday's committee presentation. She could feel the collective uncertainty in the air, nobody quite sure whether she'd committed professional suicide or performed an act of principled courage. Westbrook's office door was closed when she arrived. She sat in the waiting area, her posture calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. At precisely 8 o'clock, the door opened and Edmund Hartley emerged, his expression carefully neutral. He's ready for you, Hartley said quietly. For what it's worth, I argued against termination. I thought you should know that. Thank you, Edmund, Irene replied, meaning it. Despite everything, Hartley had tried to mentor her within the limitations of his own understanding. It wasn't his fault that those limitations had been so constraining. Inside the office, Westbrook sat behind his massive desk with the Human Resources Director, Patricia Monroe, seated to his right. The arrangement felt like a tribunal, which Irene supposed was exactly what it was. Sit down, Miss Hill, Westbrook began without preamble. I'll be direct. Your actions yesterday were a severe breach of professional conduct. You used company resources, research conducted during company time, and proprietary methodologies to undermine an official Thornbridge proposal. I used my own time, my own resources, and publicly available research. Irene corrected calmly. I presented as an independent engineer, not as a Thornbridge representative. Semantics, Westbrook snapped. You knew exactly what you were doing. You deliberately sabotaged months of work by our senior team. Patricia Monroe cleared her throat, consulting a file. Ms. Hill, we've reviewed your employment contract. There's a clause prohibiting employees from presenting conflicting professional opinions on projects where Thornbridge has been retained as the primary consultant. I'm aware of that clause, Irene said. It applies to employees presenting conflicting opinions while representing themselves as Thornbridge personnel. I made clear I was presenting independently. Another distinction without meaning, Westbrook said. The committee knew you worked here. Your presence reflected on this firm whether you claimed independence or not. Irene leaned forward slightly. Jeffrey, may I ask you something directly? If my proposal had been worthless, if the committee had dismissed it immediately, would we be having this conversation? Westbrook's jaw tightened. That's irrelevant. It's completely relevant. You're not angry because I broke protocol. You're angry because the committee took my proposal seriously. Because 15 experienced professionals looked at my evidence and couldn't dismiss it. I'm angry, Westbrook said, his voice rising. Because you showed complete disregard for authority, for experience, for the collaborative process that makes engineering firms function. You're a junior engineer who decided she knew better than everyone else. I'm an engineer who found a better solution and presented it when internal channels made that impossible, Irene replied. If Thornbridge had been willing to seriously consider alternatives, we wouldn't be here. Patricia Monroe intervened, her tone more diplomatic. Miss Hill, regardless of the technical merits, you must understand that your actions have created an impossible situation. How can we maintain team cohesion when junior staff feel entitled to contradict senior decisions publicly? How can you maintain excellence when junior staff aren't allowed to contribute beyond their assigned boxes? Irene countered. I spent 18 months doing exceptional work that nobody noticed because it didn't fit your expectations of what I should be capable of. Westbrook pulled out a formal document, sliding it across the desk. This is your termination notice, effective immediately. We'll provide 2 months severance contingent on your signing a non-disparagement agreement. Irene picked up the document, scanning it quickly. The non-disparagement clause was broad, essentially preventing her from discussing anything about her employment or the cathedral project. She set it down without signing. I won't sign that, she said simply. Then you'll receive no severance and no recommendation, Patricia warned. I understand, but I won't agree to be silenced about what happened here. Irene stood, straightening her jacket. Jeffrey, you told me yesterday there would be consequences. You were right, but consequences flow in multiple directions. Is that a threat? Westbrook asked. It's an observation. The committee will make their decision in 2 weeks. If they choose my proposal, Thornbridge's reputation for innovation and client service will be questioned. If they choose yours, you'll be implementing an inferior solution at triple the necessary cost. Either way, the consequence of dismissing good engineering when it came from the wrong person will follow you. She walked to the door, then paused. I came to Thornbridge because I believed in what this firm represented: excellence, integrity, advancing the field. I'm sorry to discover that those values matter less than maintaining comfortable hierarchies. You're young, Westbrook said, his voice tired now rather than angry. You'll learn that idealism doesn't survive contact with reality. Irene looked back at him, this man who'd risen to leadership by navigating systems rather than challenging them. I hope you're wrong about that, because if you're right, I'd rather find a different profession. She closed the door quietly behind her and walked through the design floor one final time. A few colleagues watched her go. Most kept their heads down. Only Rachel, one of the few women in the firm who worked in architectural design, met her eyes and gave a small nod of solidarity. Outside, the morning sun was warm on Irene's face. She'd just lost her job, possibly damaged her professional reputation, and faced an uncertain future. But as she loaded her final boxes into her car and drove away from Thornbridge Engineering, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months. The lightness of knowing she'd finally stopped making herself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold her. The 2 weeks following her termination passed in a strange suspension between anxiety and relief. Irene spent her days refining her cathedral proposal, preparing for the possibility that the committee might request additional information. She updated her resume, reached out to contacts in the industry, and began exploring independent consulting opportunities. The responses were mixed. Some colleagues from university reached out with support and offers to connect her with other firms. Others were conspicuously silent, clearly unwilling to associate with someone who'd publicly challenged her employer. The engineering community was smaller than people realized, and reputation mattered enormously. Her parents called every few days, her father proud, and her mother worried in equal measure. You did the right thing, her father kept saying. Standing up for what's correct is never wrong. Her mother was more practical. But how will you pay rent next month? Both questions were valid. Irene had savings for about 4 months, maybe 6 if she was careful. After that, she'd need actual employment, not just principles and vindication. On the 10th day, Helena from the committee secretariat called. Miss Hill, Director Schmidt would like you to attend a follow-up session tomorrow afternoon. Can you be available at 2 o'clock? Of course, Irene replied, her heart rate accelerating. Should I prepare additional materials? Just be ready to answer questions. The committee has been very thorough in their review. The next afternoon, Irene returned to the city council building, carrying her portfolio and trying to read meaning into Helena's carefully neutral expression. The committee room was arranged differently this time, less formal, with chairs arranged in a semicircle rather than the previous tribunal-style setup. Director Schmidt greeted her with a handshake that felt genuinely warm. "Ms. Hill, thank you for coming. We've spent considerable time reviewing both proposals, consulting with additional experts, and analyzing the technical merits of each approach." Irene sat, acutely aware that her entire professional future might pivot on the next few minutes of conversation. The committee members were all present, their expressions revealing nothing. "I'll be direct," Schmidt continued. "Your proposal is technically superior in every measurable way. Lower cost, shorter timeline, better historic preservation, and based on our consultations with structural experts from 3 universities, equally sound from an engineering standpoint." Irene felt something release in her chest, but Schmidt's tone suggested there was more coming. "However," he continued, and there it was, "we have concerns about implementation. Thornbridge Engineering has decades of experience with projects of this scale. You're a talented individual engineer, but you don't have an organization behind you, insurance capacity for a project this size, or a track record of completed restorations." One of the council members spoke up. "Simply put, Ms. Hill, we love your solution. We're just not sure you can execute it." The words were fair, objectively reasonable, and still felt like a door closing. Irene had developed the better approach, proven its merit, and now faced rejection not for her engineering, but for her lack of institutional backing. "I understand your concerns," Irene said carefully. "What if I could address them?" "How?" Schmidt asked, genuinely curious. "Give me 1 week. Let me put together an implementation team with the necessary credentials and backing. If I can't, then proceed with Thornbridge's proposal. But if I can, consider giving this project to people who actually believe in the approach they're implementing." The committee members exchanged glances. One of the Heritage Foundation representatives leaned forward. "And if we give you this week and you fail, we've lost time on a project that's already urgent." 7 days against 18 months, Irene replied. "That's 0.4% of Thornbridge's timeline, and in return, you potentially save €2 million and preserve the cathedral's historic integrity." Schmidt drummed his fingers on the table, thinking, 1 week. "But Ms. Hill, understand that we need more than enthusiasm. We need licensed contractors, insurance documentation, detailed implementation plans, and credible project management. Can you actually deliver that?" "Yes," Irene said with more confidence than she felt. "I can deliver that." As she left the building, Irene realized she'd just committed to building an entire engineering implementation team in 7 days. She had no firm, no established relationships with contractors, and no clear path to the kind of institutional backing the committee required. What she did have was a phone full of contacts, a proposal that had impressed 3 university engineering departments, and a week to prove that excellence could come from unexpected sources. She sat in her car, pulled out her phone, and started making calls. The first was to Professor Weber at Technical University of Vienna, who'd supervised her thesis and who still consulted on historic restoration projects throughout Europe. "Irene," Weber's warm voice came through. "I heard about your cathedral presentation. Brilliant work, absolutely brilliant. Professor, I need to ask for help. Significant help. Tell me what you need." Over the next hour, Irene outlined her situation and what she needed to assemble in 7 days. Weber listened without interrupting, then said simply, "I know exactly who you need to talk to. Start with Stefan Richter at Alpine Restoration Contractors. Tell him I sent you and that this is the St. Benedict project. He'll understand." By evening, Irene had contacted 12 people. By the end of the next day, she'd spoken with 40. Engineers who'd worked on similar projects, contractors who specialized in historic restoration, insurance brokers who understood heritage project requirements. Slowly, improbably, a team began to take shape. On the 4th day, Stefan Richter called back. "Ms. Hill, I've reviewed your proposal. My firm is interested in partnering on implementation. We have the licensing, insurance capacity, and restoration experience the committee needs. If you're serious about leading the engineering aspects, we're serious about supporting you. Irene felt tears sting her eyes, relief and validation flooding through her. I'm absolutely serious. When can we meet? Tonight. Bring everything you have. Let's build something that shows these committees what's possible when they trust the right solution instead of the safe name. The conference room at Alpine Restoration. Contractors' headquarters felt more like a workshop than an office, with architectural models on shelves and historic building photographs covering the walls. Stefan Richter was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that showed decades of actual restoration work. His team included 3 senior engineers, 2 project managers, and a contract specialist. Show us everything, Richter said, pouring coffee as Irene set up her laptop. For 3 hours, she walked them through every aspect of her proposal. The technical analysis, the historical research, the drainage restoration methodology, the timeline projections, the cost breakdowns. The team listened intently, occasionally stopping her to ask questions that demonstrated they understood both the engineering principles and the practical implementation challenges. The drainage network restoration is straightforward, one of the senior engineers commented, studying Irene's ground-penetrating radar surveys. We've done similar work on Abbey foundations in Switzerland. The challenge will be connecting the historical stone channels to modern outflow systems without damaging the original construction. I've detailed 3 potential connection approaches, Irene replied, pulling up the relevant specifications. Each preserves the historic stonework while creating effective modern drainage capacity. Richter was reviewing her budget projections with his contract specialist. Your cost estimates are conservative, which is smart, but you've underestimated permit processing time. Historic sites require approval from multiple authorities. That could extend your timeline. I've identified 3 permits that can be processed in parallel rather than sequentially, Irene explained, showing her project management flowchart. The total calendar time is longer, but the actual work timeline remains at 4 months. The project manager smiled. You've actually thought about implementation logistics, not just engineering theory. That's rare. As midnight approached, Richter called for a break. He pulled Irene aside while his team continued reviewing documentation. I'm going to be direct with you. This proposal is excellent. Your engineering is sound, your research is thorough, and your implementation planning is more detailed than half the proposals we receive from established firms. But, Irene prompted, sensing the hesitation, but you're young, unknown, and you just got fired from your previous employer. The committee is going to question whether you can handle the pressure and complexity of a high-profile restoration. My firm can provide institutional backing, but you'd be the lead engineer. Can you handle that? Irene met his gaze steadily. Stefan, I spent 18 months being told I wasn't ready for responsibility. I prepared for opportunities that never came, developed skills nobody asked for, and pursued excellence that nobody noticed. When a crisis emerged, I was the only person who'd actually prepared to solve it. So yes, I can handle this. The question is whether you're willing to give someone without a famous name the chance to prove it. Richter studied her for a moment, then smiled. My father was a stonemason, worked on cathedral restorations throughout Austria. He used to say that the best buildings weren't made by the architects with the biggest reputations, but by the craftsmen who actually understood stone. I think he'd like your approach. He called his team back together. Here's what we're going to do. Alpine Restoration will partner with Ms. Hill as lead engineering consultant. We'll provide project management, contracting capacity, insurance backing, and implementation logistics. Ms. Hill maintains engineering authority and decision-making on all technical matters. If the committee approves the project, we execute her design exactly as she specified. The contract specialist looked up from her laptop. I'll need 2 days to draft partnership agreements and compile our credentials documentation. Can you have your final presentation materials ready by Friday morning? Absolutely, Irene replied. Over the next 2 days, Irene worked with Alpine's team to create a comprehensive implementation proposal. It was no longer just her engineering solution, but a complete project package with construction schedules, resource allocation, quality control protocols, and risk management strategies. the difference between a brilliant idea and an executable plan. Friday morning, she returned to the committee with documentation that was twice as thick as her original proposal. Helena smiled when she saw the Alpine Restoration branding on the materials. I was hoping you'd find a partner. Director Schmidt will be pleased. The committee session was businesslike and thorough. Richter presented Alpine's credentials and restoration experience. Irene walked through the technical engineering aspects. Together, they answered questions about timeline, budget, risk mitigation, and project oversight. The committee members were engaged and serious, their questions probing but not hostile. When the presentation concluded, Director Schmidt leaned back in his chair. Ms. Hill, Mr. Richter, this is impressive work. You've addressed every concern we raised last week. The committee will deliberate and provide our decision by Monday morning. As they packed up materials, one of the council members approached Irene privately. I shouldn't tell you this, but several of us have been pushing for your proposal since the first presentation. The challenge was always implementation capacity, not engineering merit. What you've assembled in a week is remarkable. That weekend passed slowly. Irene tried to distract herself with other projects, updating her consulting business plans, reaching out to other potential clients. But her mind kept returning to the cathedral, to the committee's deliberation, to the possibility that everything might actually work out. Sunday evening, her phone rang. Director Schmidt's voice was formal but warm. Ms. Hill, the committee has reached a decision. Rather than make you wait until tomorrow, I wanted to inform you personally. The Cathedral of St. Benedict Restoration Project has been awarded to the Alpine Restoration and Irene Hill Partnership. Your proposal was approved unanimously. Irene sat down heavily, her legs suddenly unreliable. Thank you, Director Schmidt. I promise you won't regret this decision. I don't believe we will. There was considerable debate about choosing an unconventional approach from an unconventional source. But ultimately, the committee agreed that the best engineering should win, regardless of where it comes from. You've given us an opportunity to preserve historic integrity while managing costs responsibly. That's exactly what public stewardship should be. After the call ended, Irene sat in her apartment's gathering darkness, letting the reality settle over her. She'd done it. Not by following proper channels or waiting her turn or accepting limitations others imposed. She'd done it by refusing to be quiet when she knew she was right, by building capacity when none was offered, and by showing 15 men on a committee that excellence could come from unexpected sources. Her phone buzzed with a text from Stefan Richter. Congratulations, partner. Monday morning, we start changing minds about who gets to do important work. See you at 8 a.m. Irene looked at the cathedral visible through her window, its leaning tower waiting for the restoration that would preserve 500 years of history. In 4 months, that tower would stand straight again, stabilized by the same engineering principles that had supported it for centuries. And everyone who'd dismissed her, who'd told her she wasn't ready, who'd kept her in corners counting equipment while others did meaningful work, would have to acknowledge what she'd known all along. Readiness isn't about fitting expectations. It's about exceeding them. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that felt like vindication made weather. Irene met Stefan Richter and his team at the cathedral site for the official project launch. The restoration board had arranged a small ceremony with local press coverage, the mayor's representative, and Director Schmidt representing the committee. As they gathered in the cathedral's courtyard, Irene noticed a familiar car pulling into the parking area. Jeffrey Westbrook emerged, followed by Thomas Brennan and Edmund Hartley. Her former employers had come to witness the beginning of the project that had cost them both a lucrative contract and a measure of professional prestige. Westbrook approached Richter rather than Irene, his handshake stiff and formal. Stefan, congratulations on winning the contract. I'm sure Thornbridge would be happy to provide consulting support if needed. That's generous, Jeffrey, Richter replied smoothly, but I think we have all the expertise we need. Ms. Hill's engineering is exceptionally thorough. It was a diplomatic rebuke, and Westbrook's expression showed he felt it. He turned to Irene, managing a tight smile. Well done, Miss Hill. I hope the project proceeds smoothly. Thank you, Jeffrey, Irene replied, matching his formal tone. There was nothing to be gained from gloating, and everything to be proven through successful execution. Edmund Hartley lingered after Westbrook moved away. Irene, I owe you an apology. I should have fought harder to have your ideas heard at Thornbridge. I let institutional inertia override my judgment. You worked within the system as you understood it, Irene said, softening slightly. The problem wasn't you personally, Edmund. It was a system that valued conformity over innovation. Will you accept a reference if you need one? Not from Thornbridge officially, but from me personally. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. The ceremony itself was brief. Director Schmidt spoke about responsible stewardship of historic resources. The mayor's representative praised innovative approaches to preservation. And then Richter introduced Irene as the project's lead engineer, the person whose vision and determination had made this restoration possible. Standing before the assembled crowd, with cameras recording and the cathedral rising behind her, Irene felt the weight of 18 months of dismissal finally lifting. This project succeeds by honoring the brilliance of the original builders, she said. They understood their environment, their materials, and the principles of lasting construction. Our job isn't to replace their work with something modern, but to restore the systems that made their design successful. That's not just good engineering, it's good stewardship. After the ceremony, as contractors began setting up equipment for the preliminary excavation work, Irene walked the cathedral grounds with her survey team. They were mapping the exact locations where they'd begin uncovering the historic drainage channels, planning each phase of excavation to minimize disruption while maximizing archaeological documentation. One of Alpine's senior engineers, Martin Koch, pointed to an area where ground-penetrating radar showed a particularly well-preserved section of the original system. Your analysis was right. The stonework is intact, just blocked. This is going to be textbook restoration work. Let's make sure we document everything thoroughly, Irene replied. This project needs to stand as proof that respecting historic engineering principles works. Other sites are dealing with similar issues. What we learn here could influence preservation approaches throughout Europe. Over the following weeks, the project proceeded exactly as Irene had planned. The excavation revealed the drainage network in remarkably good condition, confirming her research. The connection to modern outflow systems went smoothly. Most importantly, as they cleared blockages and restored water flow, monitoring equipment showed the foundation beginning to stabilize. The tower's lean, which had been increasing at 2 millimeters per month, stopped. Then, slowly but measurably, it began to correct itself as the soil beneath the foundation returned to its natural equilibrium. By the end of the second month, the tower had straightened by 8 millimeters, and structural stress measurements showed significant improvement. The restoration board was thrilled. Director Schmidt visited the site weekly, each time more impressed by the progress. This is exactly what we'd hoped for, he told Irene during one inspection. Minimal intervention, maximum result, and you're ahead of schedule. The original builders did the hard work 500 years ago, Irene replied. We're just unclogging what they built. Word of the project's success spread quickly through engineering and preservation circles. Irene began receiving inquiries from other historic sites facing similar issues. Universities requested permission to document the restoration as a case study. Professional journals asked her to write articles about the methodology. Most significantly, she began receiving offers. Engineering firms interested in her expertise. Consulting opportunities for projects throughout Europe. Partnership proposals from preservation specialists who recognized that her approach represented something valuable, engineering that worked with history rather than against it. 3 months into the 4-month timeline, with the tower fully stabilized and only finishing work remaining, Irene received an unexpected call. It was Professor Weber from Technical University. Irene, I'm calling with an opportunity. The university is creating a new research position focused on historic preservation engineering. We want someone who can teach while also leading real-world projects. The compensation is competitive. You'd have access to university resources and graduate students, and you'd be able to pursue consulting independently. That sounds ideal, Irene said carefully, but I imagine you have many qualified candidates. We do. You're the only one we're offering it to. Your cathedral project has demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking we want to promote. Innovative approaches grounded in respect for proven principles. Will you consider it? Irene looked out at the cathedral, its tower now standing straight and true, vindication made stone. Yes, Professor, I'll absolutely consider it. That evening, she sat in her apartment reviewing the day's progress reports when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was from Rachel, her former colleague at Thornbridge. Thought you'd want to know? 3 women have been hired into structural engineering at Thornbridge in the last month. And Edmund is leading a new initiative to review junior engineers for potential advancement. Your impact is bigger than one cathedral. Thank you for showing us what's possible. Irene smiled, saving the message. Change happens slowly in established institutions, but it did happen. Every time someone challenged assumptions, every time excellence came from unexpected sources, every time the right solution won despite coming from the wrong person, the foundation shifted slightly. 4 months after the project began, the Cathedral of St. Benedict restoration was completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule and 40,000 euros under budget. The official completion ceremony drew a larger crowd than the launch had, including representatives from the European Heritage Foundation, engineering professionals from across the continent, and journalists from architectural publications. The tower stood perfectly vertical, its stonework preserved, its foundation stabilized using the same principles that had supported it for 5 centuries. Monitoring equipment showed that the structure had reached complete equilibrium, with stress measurements indicating it would remain stable for generations to come. Director Schmidt addressed the gathered crowd in the cathedral's courtyard. This project represents more than successful engineering. It represents a shift in how we approach historic preservation. Ms. Hill demonstrated that innovation sometimes means looking backward to understand what worked, rather than always pushing forward with modern solutions that may not be appropriate. When Irene took the podium, she saw faces that had changed their expression since that first committee meeting. The skepticism had transformed into respect, the doubt into recognition. But she also saw younger engineers in the crowd, particularly several young women who traveled specifically to see the project and meet her. The real success of this restoration, Irene began, belongs to the 16th century builders who created a system so sophisticated it still functions perfectly when properly maintained. Our generation's contribution was simply the humility to recognize their brilliance and the commitment to preserve rather than replace it. She paused, looking at the young engineers watching intently. But I also learned something else during this project. Excellence doesn't wait for permission. If you have skills and knowledge that can solve real problems, you have an obligation to use them, even when the systems around you suggest you should wait your turn or stay in your assigned role. The world needs your solutions too much to wait for you to fit someone else's timeline. After the ceremony, Irene spent an hour talking with the young engineers who'd come to meet her. They asked about her research methodology, her approach to challenging established thinking, and most frequently, how she'd found the courage to risk her career for a principle. It wasn't courage, Irene told a young woman from Belgium who reminded her of herself 2 years ago. It was calculation. I looked at my options and realized that a career where I couldn't use my abilities wasn't worth protecting. Once I understood that, the risk became acceptable. Later that afternoon, Stefan Richter found Irene standing alone in the cathedral, looking up at the tower that had become the physical manifestation of everything she'd fought for. Thinking about what comes next? He asked. Professor Weber offered me a position at Technical University, Irene replied. Teaching and research with flexibility for consulting work. Are you going to accept? I think so, though I'd want to maintain a partnership with Alpine for future projects. This won't be the last historic structure that needs engineers who understand both modern and historical principles. Richter smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. We've received inquiries about 4 other sites with similar issues. All of them specifically requested you as lead engineer. There's a castle in Scotland, an abbey in France, a bridge in Portugal, and a monastery in Greece, all dealing with foundation problems that conventional approaches have failed to solve. Irene felt excitement building. Send me the details. Let's review them together and see which ones align with research opportunities for the university program. There's one more thing, Richter said, pulling out an envelope. This came to our office, addressed to you. The return address was Thornbridge Engineering. Irene opened it carefully, expecting some final administrative detail about her termination. Instead, she found a letter from Jeffrey Westbrook, handwritten rather than typed. Miss Hill, it began. I am writing personally to acknowledge that I was wrong about your cathedral proposal and wrong about your readiness for senior responsibility. Your success has forced me to examine how Thornbridge evaluates talent and potential. While I can't change the past, I'm working to ensure the firm doesn't make similar mistakes in the future. We've implemented new protocols for reviewing ideas from all team members, regardless of seniority. Several junior engineers have already contributed innovations that I'm embarrassed to say we would have previously dismissed. This change is directly attributable to your example. I don't expect forgiveness for how you were treated, but I wanted you to know that your impact extends beyond the cathedral. Professionally, Jeffrey Westbrook. Irene read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it in her portfolio. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement. More importantly, it was evidence that challenging unjust systems could create change beyond individual victories. As evening approached and the cathedral's shadow stretched across the courtyard, Irene walked the perimeter one final time. She touched the ancient stone, felt the solidity of foundations that had stood for 500 years and would stand for 500 more. Tomorrow, she'd begin discussing the university position, planning future projects, and building the career she'd always envisioned. But tonight, she simply stood in the space between who she'd been and who she was becoming, between being dismissed and being recognized, between asking for permission and taking authority. She let 15 men surround her with their doubts and dismissals, and then she'd shown them exactly who she was. An engineer who understood that the strongest structures are built on foundations of certainty, that excellence speaks louder than hierarchy, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to accept limitations that others impose. The cathedral bells rang evening prayer, their sound carrying across the city. Irene smiled and walked toward her car, ready for whatever came next. She'd built her foundation. Now it was time to see what structures she could raise upon it. 6 months after the cathedral's completion, Irene stood before a lecture hall at Technical University of Vienna, facing 80 graduate students in her first class on historic preservation engineering. The room was more diverse than any engineering space she'd worked in before, with students from 15 countries and a gender balance that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. This course, she began, is about understanding that innovation doesn't always mean invention. Sometimes the most advanced engineering comes from recognizing the brilliance of what's already been built and having the wisdom to preserve rather than replace it. She clicked to her first slide, showing the Cathedral of St. Benedict before and after restoration. This project succeeded because we asked a different question. Not how do we fix this with modern methods, but what did the original builders understand that we've forgotten? The semester unfolded with a rhythm that felt both challenging and deeply satisfying. Teaching forced Irene to articulate principles she'd developed intuitively, to defend methodologies she'd proven through practice, to inspire the next generation of engineers to think beyond conventional approaches. Her consulting work through Alpine restoration continued in parallel. The Scottish Castle project was particularly complex, requiring 3 months of on-site analysis and a solution that combined medieval engineering principles with carefully integrated modern drainage systems. Each project refined her methodology and expanded her reputation. By spring, Irene had published 2 papers in prestigious engineering journals, presented at 3 international conferences, and been invited to consult on preservation projects across Europe. But perhaps the most meaningful development came from an unexpected source. Edmund Hartley contacted her to request a meeting. They met at a cafe near the university, the interaction carrying none of the hierarchical awkwardness of their previous relationship. "I'm leading a new initiative at Thornbridge," Edmund explained. "We're restructuring how we evaluate and develop junior engineers. I was hoping you'd be willing to consult on the program design." "Why me?" Irene asked directly. "Because you experienced firsthand what happens when talented people are systematically underutilized. We need someone who understands both the technical excellence we're trying to identify and the institutional barriers that prevent us from seeing it." Irene considered the offer carefully. "I'm not interested in helping Thornbridge look progressive while maintaining the same underlying problems." "I'm not asking you to provide cover," Edmund replied. I'm asking you to help us actually change. We've lost 3 major contracts in the last year to firms that are more innovative and inclusive. The market is telling us that our approach is obsolete. Will you help us adapt before we become irrelevant? Over the following months, Irene worked with Thornbridge to redesign their talent development systems. Anonymous project submissions that were evaluated purely on technical merit, mandatory rotation of junior engineers through different project types, formal mechanisms for presenting alternative approaches without hierarchical penalties. The changes were substantive and, she learned, were being adopted by other engineering firms across Europe. The ripple effects continued expanding. Young engineers reached out regularly, sharing stories of how her cathedral project had inspired them to pursue preservation work or challenge conventional thinking in their own fields. Universities began redesigning curricula to include historical engineering principles alongside modern methods. Professional organizations invited her to develop new certification standards for preservation engineering. One afternoon, while working in her university office, Irene received an email from the European Heritage Foundation. They were creating a new award recognizing engineers who demonstrated innovative approaches to historic preservation. She was to be the inaugural recipient, with the ceremony scheduled for the following month in Brussels. The award ceremony brought together preservation professionals, engineers, historians, and government officials from across Europe. When Irene accepted the recognition, she looked out at the audience and saw the young Belgian engineer who'd attended the cathedral completion ceremony, now working on her own restoration project. She saw Stefan Richter, whose willingness to partner with an unconventional engineer had made everything possible. She saw Professor Weber, whose support had opened doors when others were closing. This award honors not just one project or one engineer, Irene said during her acceptance speech, but a principle that excellence should be recognized regardless of where it comes from, that innovation sometimes means looking backward to understand what worked, that the best solutions often come from people who've been told they're not ready, not qualified, not what decision makers expect. She paused, thinking about that morning 2 years ago when she'd walked into a committee meeting, knowing she might destroy her career. I was once told that idealism doesn't survive contact with reality, but I've learned that's wrong. Idealism backed by competence, preparation, and refusal to accept arbitrary limitations doesn't just survive, it changes reality. After the ceremony, as Irene mingled with colleagues and celebrated with friends, she received a text from Rachel at Thornbridge. The design floor has 12 women now. Half of them cite you as inspiration for entering structural engineering. You changed more than one cathedral. That evening, Irene stood on her hotel balcony overlooking Brussels, thinking about the journey from invisible logistics specialist to recognized preservation engineer. The path hadn't been smooth or easy. It had required risking security for principle, challenging authority with evidence, and building capacity when none was offered. But it had proven something essential, that being underestimated could become an advantage if you used the time to prepare, that being dismissed could fuel determination rather than defeat, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply refuse to stay small in spaces designed to contain you. Her phone buzzed with an email from a graduate student facing resistance to her unconventional thesis proposal. Professor Hill, they're telling me my approach is too risky. How did you find the courage to push forward when everyone said no? Irene smiled and began typing her response. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the calculation that some things matter more than safety. If your approach is sound and your preparation is thorough, then the risk isn't failure. The risk is never trying. Trust your evidence, build your foundation, and show them who you really are. She sent the message and looked out at the city lights, thinking about cathedrals and towers, foundations and structures, about all the young engineers preparing to challenge assumptions and exceed expectations. Somewhere, in lecture halls and design offices and construction sites, the next generation was learning that excellence doesn't wait for permission, that innovation comes from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let them surround you with their doubts, then show them exactly who you really are. The cathedral still stood in the distance of her memory, its tower straight and true, a monument not just to 16th century builders, but to everyone who'd ever been told they weren't enough and then proved otherwise. Irene Hill had been that person. And now she was helping create a world where fewer people would need to fight the same battles, where talent would be recognized regardless of packaging, where the best engineering would win simply because it was best. That, she thought, was a foundation worth building on. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.